This is Story Recapped. Today, I'm going to explain a comedy, horror, sci-fi film called Bride of Reanimator. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Herbert West and Dan Cain were medical students involved in gruesome experiments that resulted in a massacre at the Miskatonic University Hospital in Arkham, Massachusetts. Following the horrific incident, the two men were assigned to work as medics in Peru during the Civil War. Despite the tragic results of the experiment, Herbert continues testing his reagent, a chemical substance he created to revive corpses. He injects the formula on soldiers who die in their medical tent. Although Dan disapproves of the experiments, he can't seem to stop Herbert. While Herbert is experimenting with a fresh corpse, Italian journalist Francesca Dinelli enters their tent and informs them that they have to retreat because the enemy forces are storming in the front lines. The corpses come back to life and attempts to strangle Herbert, so the doctor shoots him in the head. Francesca warns the two doctors that they're in danger, but Herbert is reluctant to leave because he would lose access to fresh corpses for his experiments. Herbert contends that his research is no longer just about reanimating the dead. He tells Dan that he now wants to create a new life. As the enemy forces attack, they have no choice but to leave. However, an enemy soldier enters their tent and attacks the two doctors before they can escape. Dan manages to hack the soldier's head with a machete, but the soldier stabs him in the abdomen. Herbert shoots the other attacking soldiers before checking Dan's wounds and pulling him out of the tent. After their ordeal in Peru, Herbert and Dan return to Massachusetts to serve as doctors at the Miskatonic University Hospital. One of their patients is a terminally ill woman named Gloria. As Herbert and Dan prepare her for surgery, Gloria remarks that her head is the only part of her body that is not sick. Dan tells her not to worry and assures her that he'll take good care of her. After the nurses take Gloria away, Dan tells Herbert that she can't be part of his experiment despite her terminal condition. That evening, Lieutenant Leslie Chapham stops by the pathology lab to ask Dr. Wilbur Graves about the massacre at the hospital. Chapham takes out the head of Dr. Carl Hill from a bag and tells Graves that it was found in a carnival sideshow outside the city. Chapham points out that Carl died in the massacre 8 months ago, but his head is still well preserved. Graves notes that the other corpses found that night exhibit the same qualities. In the storage room, Chapham sees a bottle of green chemical on a shelf, so he asks Graves what it is. Graves notes that he still hasn't identified the substance, but he knows Carl worked on it before he died. Graves takes Chapham to the crematorium and shows him a corpse of a ballet dancer who took her own life. He discloses that the dancer cut off her feet and bled to death because she saw herself as a failure. When Chapham asks where her feet are, Graves reveals that they're missing. Ernest, the man in charge of the crematorium, suddenly butts in and discloses that many body parts have been missing from the crematorium lately. Later, Herbert goes to the pathology lab storage room to steal a human heart. When he sees Carl's head, he starts mocking it and notes that Carl's experiment helped him discover that consciousness can be found in every part of the body. When Dan gets home that night, Herbert demonstrates a new chemical that can stimulate a heart attack without leaving a trace. Herbert uses the substance on an iguana and tells Dan that it can be useful for obtaining fresh animal specimens. Afterward, he extracts the amniotic fluid from the iguana and combines it with his reagent. He then attaches severed fingers and an eye to a wire to revive them with the modified reagent. A few seconds later, the two men see the fingers moving like a spider. Dan castigates Herbert for his grotesque experiments, but Herbert reminds him that he didn't reject his work when he used the substance on his deceased girlfriend, Megan. As they argue, the eye and finger creature sneaks out of the tray. Herbert decides to show the heart he stole from the morgue to Dan, noting that it belonged to Megan, and he wants to use it to create a new life. Dan is unable to resist the thought of being with Megan again, even with just a part of her, so he promises to help Herbert with his experiments. Moments later, Chapham arrives to ask them questions about the massacre at the hospital. When Chapham notices the condition of their house, Dan explains that it used to be a mortuary that became the caretaker's house after the cemetery filled up. As Chapham starts asking Herbert about the nature of his experiments, the eye and finger creature walks behind Chapham on the couch. Dan tries to catch it, but it jumps to the seat beside the lieutenant. As Chapham prepares to leave, he unknowingly slams a book on the creature. As soon as he gets out of the house, Herbert checks on the creature and finds that it has been crushed. The following day, Graves starts performing experiments with a reagent to find out what it does. After looking at the substance under the microscope, Graves injects it into a dead bat. Within a few seconds, the bat starts squealing and flapping its wings. Soon, the bat flies all over the room and lands on Graves' face, so he decides to cut off its wings. Later, Herbert goes to the crematorium to steal a body, but Ernest is there, so Herbert tells him Graves needs him in the pathology lab. At the same moment, Graves injects the reagent into Carl's head and brings him back to life. Carl immediately recognizes Graves and tells him that he's not fond of his theories. When Ernest arrives, Graves tries to show him that Carl's head can speak, But Carl remains still while Ernest is there. As soon as Ernest is gone, Carl orders Graves to assist him with his unfinished business. Herbert and Dan attempt to leave the hospital with a stolen corpse by disguising it as a patient. When they get outside, Dan comes across Francesca, who's in the state for the week to do some interviews. Dan suddenly gets paged by the hospital while they're chatting, so he invites Francesca to dinner later that night. After he leaves, Chapham approaches Francesca to ask her about Dan. Chapham takes Francesca to the psychiatric ward and tells her about the massacre at the morgue. He discloses that a naked maniac killed his partner by tearing off his arm when they responded to the incident. He notes that the massacre was blamed on the people who ended up in the ward after the massacre, but he suspects that there's something else going on because there's a death certificate for each of the patients. Chapham takes Francesca inside the ward to let her see the patients, one of whom is his supposedly deceased wife, Elizabeth. Suddenly, Elizabeth grabs Francesca and holds her down. Fortunately, the nurses are able to grab Francesca and take her out of the room. Chapham tells Francesca that Dan and Herbert were the only normal survivors of the massacre. He notes that Dan was holding his girlfriend's dead body that night, but the corpse was still twitching when they were found. At the secret lab at the former mortuary, Dan and Herbert assemble different body parts that they stole from the crematorium to create a body. Dan is skeptical that they can reanimate the body, but Herbert assures him that it will work if they inject the reagent directly into the heart to redistribute the substance to the circulatory system. Soon, Francesca arrives for the dinner date, so Dan leaves Herbert alone at the lab. Later, Francesca and Dan spend time together in bed while Herbert merges a leg and an arm together. Moments after he pours reagent at it, the combined parts immediately attack Herbert, so he stuffs it inside a garbage bag. When Herbert goes upstairs, he finds Chapham waiting in the living room. He tells Chapham to leave, but the lieutenant forces his way to the basement and tells Herbert that one of the reanimated bodies during the massacre was his wife. When they reach the secret lab, Chapham sees the assembled body parts on the table and berates Herbert for desecrating corpses. Herbert, however, remains defiant and contends that Chapham is only projecting his guilt onto him. Herbert notes that his wife died of multiple blows to the head, suggesting that someone beat her up. When Herbert accuses Chapham of beating her wife, the lieutenant becomes angry and tries to hit him with a shovel. Herbert evades the attack and makes Chapham breathe a lethal chemical that induces a heart attack. A while later, Dan goes to the lab and sees Chapham dead on the floor. Herbert tells him that they now have an opportunity to test their new formula on the corpse before using it on Megan's heart, so Dan reluctantly agrees to let him use Chapham as a subject. Herbert hands Chapham's gun to Dan in case the lieutenant gets violent. As soon as Herbert injects the reagent, Chapham comes to life and attacks him. Herbert tells Dan to shoot, but Chapham hits Dan's hand, causing him to fire the gun to the ground. While Chapham wrestles with Dan for the firearm, Herbert grabs a machete and hacks Chapham's hand. Chapham soon flees from the lab and locks the two men inside. As Dan tries to break down the door, Herbert opens a secret passage that leads to a crypt in the cemetery. Startled by the noise, Francesca goes to the living room and finds Chapham lying on the sofa. Chapham tries to grab Francesca, so her dog defends her by biting Chapham's hand. Before fleeing, Chapham hurls the dog to the wall and severs its foot. Soon, Dan breaks down the door and finds Francesca crying over her dead dog in the living room. When Herbert arrives, Francesca asks him what he did to Chapham, but Herbert ignores the question and takes the dog's corpse to the lab. The next morning, Francesca wakes up and hears her dog barking, so she follows the sound to the basement. When she opens the door to the lab, Herbert comes out and tells her that she's not allowed to go in. Francesca sees her dog beside Herbert, so she kneels to pet it. However, she ends up screaming in terror when a human hand attached to the dog grabs her. When Dan arrives, Francesca flees from the house after telling him that she hates him for his involvement in the experiments. When Herbert and Dan go to work later that day, Dan visits Gloria in her room to see how she's doing. As Gloria lies quietly in bed, Dan confesses that he often fantasizes that she's Megan. Suddenly, Gloria flatlines, so Dan immediately asks other doctors for help to revive her. When they fail, Herbert opens her chest to pump her heart with his hand, but he soon decides to call the time of death when she doesn't respond. At the pathology lab, Carl instructs Graves to help him find Herbert because he has a vendetta against him, but Graves refuses, so Carl uses his psychic powers to contact Chapham and other reanimated corpses at the psychiatric ward. Unaware of Carl's abilities, Graves wraps the head with a towel and throws him in the trash can. Meanwhile, Herbert asks for Ernest's help to transport Gloria's body. Ernest is supposed to take the body to the pathology lab, but Herbert instructs him to take it straight to the crematorium. Herbert then parts ways with him while carrying a bucket. Later, Francesca arrives to look for Dan, but a nurse tells her that he left after failing to save a patient. That night, Herbert shows Gloria's head to Dan and asks for his help in attaching it to the body. He notes that it will take 2 men to fuse the brain to the spinal cord. Dan seems reluctant, so Herbert convinces him by noting that they can make Megan's heart start beating again. Back at the hospital, Carl breaks out of the garbage can with Chapham's help. Carl then takes control of Chapham to force Graves to perform surgery on his head. Later, the other zombies escape from the psychiatric ward and kill the hospital employees. At the lab, Dan and Herbert fuse Gloria's head with the body parts by putting a cloth dipped in reagent over the neck. As Herbert prepares to inject the heart with the formula, Dan stops him so he can do it himself. While they wait for the body to come to life, they hear somebody ringing the doorbell. Herbert answers the door and finds the large box, so he takes it inside. At the same moment, Francesca arrives outside the house and sees a zombie roaming in the backyard. Inside the house, Herbert opens the box and finds a human head covered in styrofoam. Suddenly, Carl's head, now affixed with bat wings, emerges from the box and flies all over the house. Outside, Francesca tries to hide from the zombies, but Chapham suddenly grabs her. While Chapham holds onto her, Elizabeth appears and attacks him, allowing Francesca to get away. Francesca jumps over the fence to get to the back door of the house, but she finds out that there's a zombie blocking the door. Soon, Gloria wakes up, so Dan performs mouth-to-mouth resuscitation to help her breathe. After a while, Gloria walks around the room, still baffled by what happened to her, so Dan explains that she's been given a new life. When the rain starts pouring outside, the zombie by the door wanders away from the house. Suddenly, Elizabeth sees Francesca hiding in the bushes, so Francesca immediately goes into the house and covers the door with furniture to avoid zombies from following her. Dan soon takes Gloria out of the basement to show Herbert that she has come to life. When Herbert touches her, Gloria seems afraid of him, so Herbert tells her that he's the one who created her. Francesca suddenly calls out to Dan to warn him that zombies are coming. Before long, Chapham breaks into the house through the window, so Dan, Gloria, and Francesca make their way back to the basement while Herbert tries to hold Chapham back. A zombie grabs Francesca on the way down, so Herbert scares him with a warning shot and shoots him in the leg. When they all reach the lab, Herbert and Francesca put a coffin behind the door to block the zombies. When Francesca asks Dan about Gloria, he claims that she's Megan, so Francesca reminds him that Megan is dead. Francesca castigates Herbert for playing God, but Herbert audaciously contends that he has created life from God's failures. Francesca pushes Gloria away from Dan as she tries to convince him to fight back against the zombies. A scuffle between the women ensues when Gloria retaliates by biting Francesca in the neck. Gloria throws Francesca at the coffin and attempts to beat her up, but Dan suddenly grabs Gloria and tells her to leave Francesca alone. Herbert tells Dan to forget about Gloria, noting that she's just an assembly of dead tissue. Distraught by what she heard, Gloria turns to Dan and asks him if he doesn't want her anymore, but Dan tells her that he doesn't want her body. Gloria rips the heart from the chest. Chapham and the other zombies soon break through the barricades and grab Francesca, so Herbert tries his best to fend them off. At the same moment, Gloria's body starts falling apart due to tissue rejection. While Chapham is strangling Francesca to death, Elizabeth arrives and beats him with a fire iron. Herbert attempts to escape from the lab through the secret passage, but Carl and the other hideous creatures from Herbert's experiments emerge to stop him. Chapham subdues Herbert and throws him into the passageway, allowing his own creation to attack him. Dan and Francesca retreat into the secret passage too. As the other zombies come after them, Dan fights off the zombies as the walls around them start crumbling. Soon, the whole structure caves in, trapping Herbert and the zombies inside. Moments later, Dan emerges from the surface of the cemetery and pulls out Francesca by the hand. Underground, Carl howls and laughs maniacally while attempting to fly out of the rubble. In the lab, Gloria clutches Megan's beating heart, but the heartbeat soon slows down and eventually stops.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.